Joining me now is John Brennan, former director of the CIA during the Obama administration and an NBC News senior national security analyst and intelligence analyst. And John, before we get into the deeper parts of this conversation, when you find out that our global rivals or opponents, however you want to view a China or a Russia these days, has come up with a new technology, how often are we surprised? Like this one seemed to catch us by surprise. Are we caught by surprise on these things when because they've yet to sell it, right? They've yet to take it to market and sell it, and that's usually how we find out about new technologies from our great power rivals?
Well, there are tactical and strategic weapon systems that the Russians, Chinese, and others are developing. And obviously, we're most concerned about any type of strategic weapon system that could alter the balance in terms of our forces. On the tactical front, as you point out, until some of these weapon systems are exported and we have an opportunity to acquire them, they can be a surprise. And I think what Russia has been doing over the last decade is modernizing its forces and probably making some enhancements and improvements to some of their tactical battlefield weapon systems. So clearly they're throwing a lot at the Ukrainians. And so Western intelligence services, military, are going to see if they can acquire these systems to learn more about them.
Israel perhaps is the best known missile sort of defense system, Iron Dome, at least best known here. Ukraine had didn't have an Iron Dome per se, but has its own defense system. How leaky is it? And how much does this technology that Russia's using make it even leakier?
Well, Ukraine is a very large country. I think it's twice the size of Italy. So trying to protect all the different cities and villages there is quite challenging. The Ukrainians have done, I think, an admirable job in terms of staving off some of these Russian attacks against their urban centers. But it is not a comprehensive system. It's not the most up-to-date. It clearly is not a NATO country, and therefore it doesn't have the type of NATO air defenses that really make it much more difficult for the Russians to penetrate those air defense systems. So again, I think Ukraine is doing better than expected by analysts in Russia as well as analysts in the West in terms of how they've been able to deal with this Russian onslaught.
Who do you think could actually penetrate Putin right now? Meaning, have a conversation where he listens. Is it someone like the Prime Minister of Israel? Is it Xi? Is it a Zelensky? It's clearly not our European allies. They've tried, and it doesn't seem they're getting very far. And at what point do you give up trying to find somebody?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single person or entity that's going to have that type of influence. I think it's if Putin is hearing some similar messages coming from the Xis and the Naftali Bennett's and others around the globe, as well as from some of his advisors, that he needs to be able to accept a partial win in his mind in terms of not being able to swallow Ukraine whole. I think if Putin hears that repeatedly from those abroad as well as from those within his inner circle, it might lead him to be able to scale back some of his overly ambitious goals in Ukraine. And so therefore, I think it is important for as many of these foreign leaders as possible to be counseling restraint and trying to get some type of cessation of these hostilities to bring an end to the bloodshed by convincing Putin that it may be in his interest to do so.
Do we only go as far as Zelensky is willing to go when it comes to negotiations right now?
Well, I think what we're seeing is an effort by Zelensky and others, again, to do whatever possible to bring a halt to the bloodshed that has resulted in so many civilian deaths, basically the mass murder that's going on in Ukraine at Putin's direction. And so therefore, I think if you're able to engage in some negotiations and have some ceasefires, see whether or not there can be a pause or a respite in the hostilities, it at least allows maybe some additional people to be evacuated and to reduce the number of casualties that are there. But having negotiated myself with the Russians over the evacuation of civilians from Aleppo, Syria, the Russians will agree to these ceasefires and then routinely violate them. They don't play by the rules of law or war, but still I think it's advisable to do whatever possible to see if we can bring some relief to the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
You know, you brought up your negotiations, your time. You were there when Crimea happened. What's the lessons learned? What's your hindsight everybody's got hindsight, and I'm not going to sit here. I'm not trying to relitigate. But what's your hindsight lesson?
Well, the Russians basically walked into Crimea because they were accepted by a good number of the Crimean people, as well as a large number of the parliamentarians in Crimea. But in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, where the Russians were supporting these separatists with a lot of support in terms of weapons, training, advisors, and even those men in green uniforms, I think what we should have done is provided some more lethal support to the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. Not the highly advanced technology included in the Javelin missiles at that time, because the Russians had fully penetrated the Ukrainian military in the years before when there was a puppet government in Kyiv. But I do think we could have provided additional weapon systems to be able to try to push the Russians back out of that eastern portion of Ukraine.
I have you on, and I got to ask you about Saudi Arabia. That was one of your portfolios when you were in the West Wing before you went over to CIA, and it looks like a tricky situation here. We have some, perhaps we have something we have plenty that they would like us to do that we're not willing to do, and they have one thing we'd like them to do that right now they're not showing a willingness to do, and that's to turn their spigot up a little bit when it comes to pumping oil. Is there a rapprochement that's possible here, or is MBS's asks just too much?
Well, I think MBS is an autocratic leader, authoritarian. That's why he likes dealing with the Russians and the Chinese, and he's been flirting with both over the past number of years. I do think it's important for us to be able to continue to apply pressure on Saudi Arabia on the humanitarian front, but also to see whether or not the Saudis will cooperate more in terms of oil production. That is important. So I don't think we should not have the dialogue, but I do think we shouldn't capitulate to some of his requirements. And therefore, things like, again, the horrific murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi and the other types of atrocities that have been perpetrated in Saudi Arabia, I think that is something that still should stay front and center. But it should not preclude the dialogue on some of these issues that are currently at the forefront. In fact,
I mean, I've always thought you, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you come from a realpolitik school of foreign policy sometimes. You've got, look, we're a country that had to ally itself with Stalin at one point. It's nothing to be proud of, but in the moment it made a lot of sense. Is that a moment we're in right now in our foreign policy, that we may have to do a national security strategy that's in the best interest of the globe, even if it's not in the best interest of some of our values?
Well, I do think what we're seeing in Ukraine is such an important strategic inflection point in terms of global affairs, and the suffering of the Ukrainian people on top of that. So I do think, as you point out, just like in World War II, we need to do what we can to try to bring an end to this awful, awful war. That doesn't mean we should be sacrificing our principles, but sometimes we have to make tactical shifts in order to address some of the longer term and more strategic and potentially existential issues that I think we're confronting right now with Russia. This war has to stop. The sooner the better. And that's why I think President Biden going off to Europe, demonstrating the resolve of America in dealing with the situation, but also that we're going to work in close concert with our NATO partners. That's a critically important message to send to the world. And the MBSs and President Xi's and others really need to take note of that.
Your personal fear now level, how likely do you think we get drawn into something militarily?
Well, I think it's certainly a distinct possibility. I'm not saying it's a probability at this point, but given that the war is taking place so close to NATO countries, given that there is this ongoing resupply of the Ukrainian military by NATO forces, and it's unclear whether or not Putin is going to try to escalate this conflict, not just in terms of the scope, but also the intensity of the shelling on Kyiv, which is really the center of the Slavic heartland, which, that's why I find it so unfathomable that he is doing this. But I do think it has the potential to escalate. And if it escalates, it could escalate quickly and very, very dangerously.